January 17, 1940, Berlin, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. The air inside the Reich Air Ministry smelled of polished oak and winter wool. Snow pressed against the tall windows overlooking Wilhelmstrasse, muffling the city beyond in a blanket of Prussian silence. In a high-ceilinged conference room, beneath oil portraits of aviators who had died gloriously in the previous war, a dozen men in gray uniforms and civilian suits leaned over aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across a mahogany table. The images, grainy and shadowed, showed American aircraft factories, vast structures in Seattle, Long Beach, and a place called Wichita that most of them had never heard of. Dr. Heinrich Wolf, a senior aviation engineer who had designed components for the Messerschmitt Bf 109, lifted one photograph to the light. His lips curled. "Look at this," he said, tapping the image with a nicotine-stained finger. "They build their bombers like Ford builds automobiles. Assembly lines. Rivets hammered by factory girls who probably cannot even read a blueprint." Around the table, there was laughter, not loud but confident. The kind of laughter that comes from men who believe they understand the world's fundamental order. One officer, whose Knight's Cross hung prominently at his collar, shook his head. "The Americans," he said slowly. "They are shopkeepers playing at war." It was a sentiment shared not only in that room but across the upper echelons of the Reich's scientific and military establishment. For years, German engineers had been the uncontested elite of European aviation. They had pioneered stressed skin construction, perfected dive-bombing techniques, and built aircraft that had terrorized Poland, shattered Rotterdam, and humiliated France. Precision engineering, they believed, was an art form, something cultivated in technical institutes, honed by craftsmen, refined through intellectual rigor. Mass production, by contrast, seemed vulgar, a confession of mediocrity. Quality, they insisted, would always triumph over quantity, and the statistics, at least in early 1940, appeared to support their confidence. Germany was producing approximately 1,000 military aircraft per month: the Heinkel He-111, the Junkers Ju-88, the Messerschmitt Bf 110. These were not merely machines. They were expressions of engineering philosophy, products of a culture that revered technical excellence. The United States, by comparison, was producing fewer than 300 military aircraft per month, many of them outdated designs that seemed laughable by Luftwaffe standards. American bombers were slow, undergunned, and lacked the range for meaningful strategic operations. The Boeing B-17, introduced in 1938, was a curiosity, a four-engine heavy bomber with ambitions that seemed to outstrip America's capacity to deploy or defend it. German intelligence analysts noted that the United States Army Air Corps had fewer than 200 of these aircraft. 200. The number was almost pitiable. Dr. Wolf set the photograph back on the table. "Let them build their toys," he said. "When the time comes, the Luftwaffe will sweep them from the sky like leaves." But outside that room, beyond the snow-dusted streets of Berlin, beyond the borders of occupied Europe, something else was stirring. Something vast and patient and utterly alien to the German understanding of industrial warfare. Across the Atlantic, in the vast interior of a nation still formally at peace, the American industrial machine was beginning to wake. Not with the sudden shock of mobilization, but with the slow, inexorable momentum of a continental economy, realizing its potential. The Boeing plant in Seattle was expanding. Douglas Aircraft in California was hiring. A new facility in Tulsa was breaking ground. In boardrooms and factory floors, in engineering schools and union halls, a transformation was underway, one that would, within 3 years, make the United States the most prolific manufacturer of military aircraft in human history. But in January 1940, that future was invisible. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the aircraft that would come to symbolize American air power, was still an experiment, a gamble, a bet on a kind of warfare that most military strategists considered theoretical. Its design philosophy was fundamentally different from anything the Luftwaffe had embraced. It was not a precision instrument. It was a platform, heavily armed, capable of carrying tons of ordnance, designed not for the swift surgical strikes that German doctrine favored, but for sustained methodical destruction. Raids measured not in hours but in waves. Campaigns that would grind an enemy's industrial capacity to dust through sheer relentless volume. The German scientists who laughed in January 1940 could not have imagined that within 4 years, the United States would be producing more than 8,000 B-17s annually. They could not have conceived of a system in which entire factories, staffed by tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had never touched a wrench before Pearl Harbor, would turn out bombers with the same ruthless efficiency that Detroit turned out sedans. They could not have foreseen the sky above their own cities darkening with formations so vast that the sound alone, the accumulated roar of thousands of Wright cyclone engines, would become a kind of auditory apocalypse, a noise that entered the soul and remained there, a frequency of dread, but all of that was still ahead. In January 1940, the laughter in the Berlin conference room was genuine. June 1941. Rechlin, Germany, Luftwaffe test facility. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the confidence of the Reich's aviation establishment had, if anything, deepened. The Luftwaffe had supported the Wehrmacht's lightning conquest with devastating effectiveness. Close air support, interdiction, terror bombing. Every tactical role had been executed with brutal precision. The campaigns in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France had validated German aviation doctrine. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the finest fighter in Europe. The Stuka dive bomber had become a symbol of blitzkrieg itself. And while the Battle of Britain had revealed certain limitations, range, attrition rates, the difficulty of achieving air superiority over a determined enemy, with radar and competent pilots, the overall strategic picture still favored Germany. The Soviet Air Force was in disarray. The British were barely holding on. And the Americans? They remained an ocean away, neutral, their industrial might still yoked to the production of consumer goods. At the Rechlin test facility, engineers continued to refine and innovate. New prototypes arrived regularly. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was entering service, a radial engine fighter that promised to outclass anything the Allies could field. Jet propulsion was being explored. Rocket-assisted interceptors were on the drawing board. German aviation science was pushing into realms that the rest of the world had barely imagined. And yet, even then, there were whispers. Intelligence reports, fragmentary and often dismissed, suggested that American production was increasing. Not incrementally, exponentially. Factories that had produced a few dozen aircraft per month in 1940 were now producing hundreds. New plants were opening, massive facilities in places with names that sounded absurd to European ears. Willow Run, Michigan, a single factory being built by the Ford Motor Company, designed to produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. The report seemed absurd. An aircraft was not a car. It could not simply be stamped and welded and rolled off a line by semi-skilled laborers. Could it? The German response was skepticism laced with disdain. Even if the Americans could produce aircraft in such quantities, what did it matter? Quantity without quality was suicide. The Luftwaffe's veterans, hardened by 2 years of continuous combat, would slaughter undertrained American pilots in inferior aircraft. It would be, one officer predicted, a harvest. But there was a flaw in this reasoning, a blind spot born of cultural arrogance. The Germans had built an air force optimized for short, decisive campaigns. Their doctrine assumed air superiority achieved quickly, after which ground forces would exploit the advantage. Attrition was acceptable if victory was swift. But what if the enemy refused to collapse? What if the war became not a series of surgical strikes, but a grinding, industrial struggle, a conflict in which the side with the most factories, the most workers, the most raw materials, would simply outlast and overwhelm? The Germans did not think in those terms. Their military tradition emphasized the operational art, the brilliant maneuver, the decisive battle. Industrial capacity was important, but it was subordinate to strategy, to leadership, to the elan of the soldier. Mass production was what nations did when they lacked the refinement to do better. It was a fatal misunderstanding. August 17, 1942. Rouen-Sotteville, France. The first American heavy bomber raid in the European theater took place on this date. 12 Boeing B-17s, escorted by RAF Spitfires, struck the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville. The raid was small, almost symbolic. Losses were minimal. Damage was modest. The Luftwaffe's response was measured, professional, unimpressed. 12 bombers. The Americans, it seemed, were learning what war meant. But those 12 bombers were the leading edge of something unprecedented. Behind them, across the Atlantic, the production lines were accelerating. Boeing's Seattle plant was running 3 shifts. Douglas and Lockheed were expanding. Vega Aircraft, a subsidiary of Lockheed, had converted an entire automobile factory to bomber production. And at Willow Run, Henry Ford's engineers had done the impossible. They had industrialized the construction of a 4-engine heavy bomber. By the end of 1942, Willow Run was producing B-24 Liberators at a rate that would have seemed fantastical just 2 years earlier. Workers who had been installing door handles on sedans were now riveting bomb bay doors. Women who had been secretaries were now operating hydraulic presses. The assembly line stretched nearly a mile. Parts arrived on one end. Finished bombers rolled out the other, one every 63 minutes at peak production. The cultural gulf was vast. In Germany, aircraft construction remained a semi-artisanal process. Skilled workers assembled components with care, ensuring fit and finish. Tolerances were tight. Inspections were rigorous. Each aircraft was, in a sense, a unique product. In America, the philosophy was different. Interchangeable parts, standardized procedures, statistical quality control. It was less romantic, less individualistic, but it was scalable in a way that German methods simply were not, and the numbers began to tell a story. In 1942, the United States produced approximately 47,000 aircraft. Germany produced around 15,000. The gap was widening. January 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The city of Schweinfurt, nestled in the Franconian hills, was home to a significant portion of Germany's ball bearing production. Ball bearings, small, precise, essential components, were required for nearly every piece of mechanized military equipment. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, vehicles all depended on them. The factories in Schweinfurt were, therefore, strategic targets of the highest order. And by early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had developed the doctrine and the capacity to strike them. On the ground, the people of Schweinfurt lived with a growing awareness of what was coming. Air raid sirens had become routine. Flak batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were stationed nearby. But there was still a sense, widely shared, that the bombers would not come in decisive numbers. The Luftwaffe was formidable. The Reich's defenses were deep. The Americans would try and they would suffer, and eventually they would abandon the effort. This was the prevailing belief. Then the formations appeared. The first large-scale daylight raid on Schweinfurt occurred on August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the modest Rouen mission. This time there were no 12 bombers. There were 376 B-17 flying fortresses, organized into combat boxes, each aircraft bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, each carrying tons of high-explosive ordnance. The formation stretched across the sky in layers, staggered altitudes, a kind of aerial architecture that was both functional and terrifying. The sound preceded them, a low, distant thunder that grew and grew until it was no longer sound but pressure, a physical sensation in the chest. On the ground, people stared upward. Some ran for shelters, others stood transfixed. A Luftwaffe officer, watching through binoculars from a command post, later wrote in his diary, "It is not possible to shoot them all down. There are too many. The sky is full of them. The raid was costly. 60 B-17s were lost to flak and fighters. Hundreds of American airmen died or were captured. The attrition rate was unsustainable, but the factories were hit. Production slowed. And more importantly, the raid demonstrated something that would eventually break the back of the Luftwaffe. The United States could absorb losses that would cripple any other air force and return, again and again in numbers that only increased. A second raid on Schweinfurt followed in October. Again, losses were heavy. Again, the factories were damaged. And again, the formations came. The German response was ferocious. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were reinforced. Tactics evolved. New weapons, rockets, heavy cannon were deployed. But the fundamental problem remained. For every bomber shot down, 3 more arrived. For every American pilot killed, 5 more graduated from training programs in Texas and Arizona and Florida. The industrial base that the German scientists had mocked in 1940 was now producing not hundreds but thousands of aircraft per month. By mid-1943, The United States was outproducing Germany in military aircraft by a margin of nearly 4-1, and it was not just quantity. The B-17 itself, derided as clumsy and vulnerable, proved astonishingly resilient. Its rugged construction, redundant systems, and heavy defensive armament allowed it to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Stories circulated of B-17s returning to base with engines shot out, tail sections shredded, entire sections of fuselage torn away. The bomber became a symbol not of precision engineering but of brute, unyielding endurance. It was built to be built quickly, flown by average pilots, and to survive catastrophic damage. It was not elegant, but it worked. German pilots, veterans of years of combat, found themselves increasingly overwhelmed. Engaging a single B-17 was dangerous. The combined defensive fire of a tight formation was lethal. Luftwaffe fighter losses began to climb. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs, unable to match the scale of Allied efforts, produced novices who died in their first missions. The qualitative edge that Germany had possessed in 1940, superior training, superior tactics, superior aircraft, was being eroded by sheer numerical superiority. Dr. Heinrich Wolf, the engineer who had laughed at American methods in 1940, was killed in an air raid on Berlin in November 1943. The bomber that dropped the ordnance that destroyed his apartment building was a B-17, one of 440 that struck the city that night, spring 1944, the Ruhr Valley. By the spring of 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had entered a new phase. The Americans flew by day, the British by night. Together they subjected German industrial centers to round-the-clock bombardment. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, was burning. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, cities that had powered the Wehrmacht's conquests, were being methodically dismantled from the air. The Luftwaffe, once the master of European skies, was now fighting a losing defensive war. Fuel shortages were chronic. Pilot training was cut short. New aircraft designs, increasingly desperate and exotic, were rushed into service before they were ready. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, a technological marvel, entered service in small numbers, too late and too few to alter the strategic balance. And above it all, the bombers kept coming. A German worker in a Krupp factory, interviewed after the war, recalled those months with a kind of numb horror. "You could set your watch by them," he said. "Every day around noon, the air raid sirens. Every day, the sound of engines. We would go to the shelters and wait, and the ground would shake, and when we came out, another part of the factory would be gone. We would clear the rubble and try to keep working, but what was the point? The next day they would come again. And the next. And the next. The psychological impact was profound. The message delivered by those endless waves of bombers was not merely tactical, it was existential. It said, you cannot win. You do not have the resources. You do not have the factories. You do not have the manpower. We will come every day, and we will destroy everything you build, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. The symbolism of the B-17, ungainly, inelegant, mass-produced, became its own kind of power. It was not a Wagnerian hero, swift and glorious. It was a freight train, relentless and impersonal. It represented something the Germans had failed to understand in 1940. That industrial warfare, at its core, was a war of logistics, of supply chains, of production capacity. It was a war in which the side with more steel, more oil, more assembly lines, more workers, would grind its opponent into submission regardless of tactical brilliance. And the numbers by 1944 were overwhelming. The United States was producing nearly 100,000 military aircraft per year. Factories operated continuously. Entire cities, Wichita, Fort Worth, Burbank, had transformed into aviation production centers. The workforce was enormous and diverse. Men and women, young and old, workers drawn from farms and cities, immigrants and native-born. Rosie the Riveter was not merely a propaganda figure. She was a reality, replicated tens of thousands of times across the American industrial landscape. The B-17 was the emblem of this transformation. It was not the most advanced bomber of the war, nor the most effective in all roles, but it was the most symbolic. Every B-17 that appeared over Germany was a rebuke to the idea that quality could substitute for quantity, that craftsmanship could replace mass production, that a smaller, more sophisticated force could outlast a larger, more resilient one. The German scientists who had laughed in 1940 were not laughing now. Many were dead. Many were in hiding. Some had fled to underground bunkers, where they continued to work on wonder weapons that would never arrive in time. The factories they had designed, the aircraft they had perfected, the doctrine they had championed, all of it was being buried under the weight of American industrial output. April 1945, the skies above Berlin. In the final weeks of the war, Berlin was a ruin. The city that had been the heart of the Reich, the capital of a 1,000-year empire, was a landscape of shattered masonry and burned-out vehicles. Soviet forces were fighting street by street into the city center. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Fuel was gone. Pilots were gone. Aircraft lay abandoned on cratered runways. And still, the bombers came. On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, over 1,000 Allied aircraft struck targets in and around Berlin. The missions were almost superfluous. The war was already decided. But they continued because the machine, once set in motion, was designed to run until the enemy was not merely defeated but annihilated. A Luftwaffe officer, captured by the Soviets and interviewed years later, recalled watching the formations pass overhead in those final days. There was no longer any fear, he said, only exhaustion. We had shot down thousands of them and it had made no difference. They kept coming. I realized then that we had lost the war not in 1945, or 1944, or even 1943. We had lost it in 1940, when we failed to understand what the Americans were capable of building. It was a bitter epiphany, but it was accurate. The war had been decided not on the battlefield, but in the factories. The campaigns in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy, they were the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms and on assembly lines. The strategic bombing campaign, with all its moral complexities and tactical debates, was fundamentally a contest of industrial endurance. And in that contest, the United States had no peer. By the end of the war, more than 12,700 B-17 flying fortresses had been built. They had flown over 290,000 sorties, dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs, and suffered a loss rate that would have broken most air forces, but they had not broken. They had, instead, become the instrument through which American industrial power expressed itself. The symbolic power of the B-17 extended beyond its military role. It was a product of democracy, of a society that harnessed the labor of free people, of an economy that could mobilize without totalitarian compulsion. The workers who built the B-17s were not slaves or conscripts. They were paid wages, protected by unions, motivated by a mixture of patriotism and economic opportunity. The contrast with the German war economy, increasingly dependent on forced labor, concentration camp inmates, and the brutal exploitation of occupied territories, was stark. One of the recurring symbols in the memories of those who witnessed the bomber offensive was the sound. Not the sound of individual aircraft, but the accumulated roar of formations. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of engines creating a noise that was felt as much as heard. It was a sound that signaled not merely destruction, but inevitability. It was the sound of assembly lines translated into air power, of factories given wings, of an industrial civilization projecting its will across the sky. Epilogue. The weight of the sky. In the years after the war, as survivors pieced together their shattered lives and historians began to document what had happened, a particular image recurred in the testimonies of those who had lived through the bombing campaigns. It was the image of the sky itself transformed, no longer a realm of clouds and weather and the distant passage of birds, but a ceiling heavy with menace, a space occupied by machines, by formations so vast that they blotted out the sun. An elderly woman in Hamburg, interviewed in the 1970s, described looking up during a raid in 1944 and seeing a sky full of metal. She struggled to articulate what it felt like, the psychological weight of knowing that above you, at altitudes you could barely comprehend, thousands of men were flying tons of machinery and ordnance, and that your survival depended on probabilities you could not calculate or influence. It made you feel very small, she said. Not small like a person feels small in nature looking at a mountain or an ocean. Small like an insect feels small when a boot is above it. The German scientists who had mocked American industrial methods in 1940 had been, in a narrow technical sense, correct. American mass production did sacrifice certain refinements. The B-17 was not as sophisticated as some German designs. Its systems were simpler, its performance in some metrics inferior. But sophistication, it turned out, was not the decisive variable. Scale was. The ability to produce not hundreds but tens of thousands of aircraft, to absorb losses, to replace destroyed units, to overwhelm defenses through sheer numerical superiority. That was the capability that mattered, and it was a capability rooted in something deeper than production techniques. It was rooted in a fundamentally different conception of society and economy. The American industrial system was not designed for elegance or perfection. It was designed for volume, for flexibility, for the mobilization of vast and diverse populations. It was a system that could take farm boys from Kansas and turn them into pilots, that could take women from textile mills and turn them into aircraft assemblers, that could convert automobile factories into bomber plants in a matter of months. The Germans had built an air force that reflected their values: precision, hierarchy, technical mastery. The Americans had built an air force that reflected theirs: pragmatism, scalability, relentless productivity. And in the crucible of total war, the latter proved decisive. The B-17 in this sense was more than an aircraft. It was a messenger. Every sortie carried the same message. You are facing not merely an army or a nation, but an entire industrial civilization that has decided you must be defeated. And that civilization possesses resources you cannot match, factories you cannot destroy faster than they can be rebuilt, and a population willing to work and fight and endure until victory is achieved. There is a photograph, taken in late 1944, that captures something of this reality. It shows a formation of B-17s over Germany, flying through flak so heavy that the sky is textured with dark bursts of shrapnel. In the foreground, one bomber is visibly damaged, smoke trailing from an engine, but it remains in formation. Behind it, others stretch to the horizon, dozens visible in the frame, and the knowledge that dozens more lie beyond the edges of the photograph. The image is both terrible and beautiful, a document of destruction, yes, but also a testament to industrial and human perseverance. The laughter in the Berlin conference room in January 1940 seems, in retrospect, almost tragic. Those men, educated, accomplished, confident, were not fools. They were working with the information and assumptions available to them. They believed sincerely that quality would triumph over quantity, that the martial virtues they admired would prevail over the crass commercialism they despised. They could not have imagined that within 5 years, the sky above their own cities would be filled with the products of that commercialism, that the factories they had mocked would bury them under a weight of steel and high explosives. There is a larger truth embedded in this story, one that transcends the specifics of World War II or the history of aviation. It is the truth that modernity, industrial modernity, democratic modernity, possesses a kind of power that cannot be easily categorized or defeated by traditional martial virtues alone. It is a power rooted not in the brilliance of individual leaders or the courage of individual soldiers, but in the collective capacity of entire societies. It is a power that operates at scales and timescales that can seem impersonal, even inhuman, but that ultimately reflects the choices and labor of millions of individuals. The 50,000 bombers, B-17s, B-24s, and others that filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific were not manifestations of American superiority in some innate or racial sense. They were manifestations of a system, an economic system that could mobilize resources on continental scales, a political system that could sustain public support for years of total war, a social system flexible enough to incorporate women and minorities into the industrial workforce, an educational system that produced enough engineers and technicians to staff tens of thousands of factories. And against this system, German technical sophistication, Japanese martial fervor, Italian strategic ambitions all proved insufficient. The Axis powers had bet on short wars, decisive campaigns, the shattering of enemy will through shock and terror. When those strategies failed, when the war became a grinding contest of attrition, they found themselves facing opponents who could simply outlast them, outproduce them, overwhelm them. The B-17, slow and ungainly and mass-produced, became the symbol of that overwhelming. It was not a weapon designed to inspire awe or terror through elegance. It was a weapon designed to be built in such numbers that resistance became futile. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. The sky above Germany, once the domain of the vaunted Luftwaffe, became an American sky. The roar of Wright Cyclone engines became the soundtrack of defeat. And the engineers who had laughed at American assembly lines, if they survived to see the war's end, understood too late that they had misjudged not merely a production method, but the nature of the conflict itself. In the final accounting, the Second World War was won by many factors: courage, sacrifice, leadership, intelligence, logistics, geography. But among those factors, one stands out with particular clarity. It was won by the side that could build more tanks, more ships, more aircraft, and keep building them no matter the losses, until victory was achieved. It was won, in other words, by the assembly line, and the B-17 flying in formations that darkened the sky was the assembly line given wings. The laughter died in the rubble of German cities. The confidence crumbled under the weight of 10,000 tons of bombs. And the lesson, written in fire and steel across the skies of Europe, was stark and unforgiving. Underestimate American industry at your peril. Mock the assembly line if you wish, but when those factories turn their attention to war, they will bury you in a deluge of production that no amount of technical sophistication can overcome. The sky, in the end, was not big enough to hide from what America could build. And 50,000 bombers, more or less, made certain that no one would forget.